So Alison and Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Peggy. One thing I'm going to tell you is that in the Whova screen, if you scroll down, don't do it right now because it'll kick you out of Whova, but you can download the slides and all of the links and everything will be available to you then. There's a lot of slides here and you may want to pull some of these into your teaching work with students. Let you know about that resource. I also encourage you to put questions either about the content or about the process or just about how all this works. We've got an incredible team of people working with us on this, so they'll answer in the chat if you send that. Our program at Emerging America is called Accessing Inquiry. And I would point you to emergingamerica.org, our website, and a lot of the resources that we're talking about are available on that site, including lesson plans and primary source sets on immigration history. We do the work we do with a lot of partners, including UMass Amherst Department of History, the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, the Library of Congress, and our program is housed in the Collaborative for Educational Services in Northampton, Massachusetts.
Hey, Rich, I don't want to interrupt, but I don't see your screen right now, and I'm guessing we're supposed to be.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. Oh, it says host disabled attendee screen sharing, so.
You should be able to share on the Zoom window.
Okay. Let me go to my Zoom. All right, there we go. Is that better?
All right, yeah, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that, folks. Thanks for interrupting. That's the kind of interruption you want. Okay. I'm going to back up a bit here, just a hair. So this is Emerging America is emergingamerica.org is our website, and that's the place. There's a ton of resources, including links to our graduate courses and workshops. And there's a list of our partners. So what we're going to do, it's going to be kind of a lightning session with a ton of information coming, but hopefully it'll all be fun. We're going to give a very quick introduction to Universal Design for Learning as a core strategy for making history and social science and civics accessible to all learners, especially students with disabilities and English learners. We're going to focus on the topic of immigration history and the history of immigrants and immigrant communities. And we're going to approach that with a really broad set of perspectives, broad set of lenses. And as we present immigration history, we're going to model some of the strategies of Universal Design for Learning and the strategies of making primary sources accessible and using them to make the curriculum accessible. And we'll also point you towards some primary source sets and primary sources on immigration. I invite you to go into the poll and in Whova and let us know what your experience is in teaching immigration history. It's helpful to me to know whether I've got a bunch of people who are really ringers or whether I've got a lot of folks who are saying, you know, I'm really pretty new to this. So far it looks like there's a lot of folks for whom everyone in America knows a lot about immigration, but teaching immigration history is a different thing. So it looks like there's a good variation there. That's exciting. So universal design for learning, I introduced the term. It's a research-based way of approaching teaching and learning to make it accessible. And what it does is it looks at the human brain and how we actually learn. And it divides learning into 3 areas: engagement, how do we engage the brain? How do we get students excited about what they're doing? Representation, meaning how do we communicate content and concepts to students? What are the different choices we give them? What are the different approaches and modes of presentation? And then action and expression refers to the students communicating their ideas and thoughts, whether it's back to us or whether it's to their peers or to the community, and acting on those. So what we're aiming to do is to activate all 3 parts of the brain in every lesson, at least somewhat, and over the course of a unit or the course of a semester, to engage all parts of the brain thoroughly and really help students access material that way. This concept of this framework comes from an organization called CAST, and they've got some great materials and a nice video that goes into more depth. Also on our website, that Accessing Inquiry website I showed you, we've got an introduction that goes deeper. What I want to do with that in this presentation is to say that in our lesson design, we put that those 3 areas at the core of lesson design. So when we do courses and teachers develop lesson plans as the main unit or the main product of a course, we have them think about how they're going to support student engagement, how they're going to make their representation reach their students, all their learners, and how they're going to enable students to express themselves in a number of different ways. We also include cultural considerations, which is not part of UDL, but it's part of just good teaching and learning to make sure you're being responsive to your students. Of course, that's particularly important for English learners, especially for English learners who are also immigrants or who have experiences in their background that we need to be attentive to help them learn. We pulled this grid from a book published by the National Council for the Social Studies on exceptional learners and social studies. And again, if you go to our website, you can find a copy of this grid and ways to use it. That cultural considerations column, I'm going to point you, we're not going to talk about it much, but I'm going to point you towards a great resource, another partner as part of the Library of Congress Teaching with Primary Sources program at the Minnesota Historical Society. Their project is called Inquiry in the Upper Midwest. You can Google that, or you can go to the Minnesota Historical Society or go through our slides to find that. So, okay, that's sort of theoretical framework, but let's dive into a primary source. And I'm guessing most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the observe, reflect, question, investigate tool that the Library of Congress uses. And this is where I'd like you to jump in the chat if you're comfortable. Don't worry about it if you're not comfortable with it. But I'd love you to say in the chat, what do you see here? And with English learners, it's important to distinguish between just observation. So for example, a simple observation would be, most of these people are wearing hats. That's just a fact. That's not a supposition or a guess. We want to get to those, but we want to start with just observations and help the students know the difference between basic observations and making inferences. So what else do you see here? What are the things that you observe? What's in this photo? Okay, they're all men. Very good. That's the kind of thing that, yeah, that's something we want students to notice. They're canning beans and chatting while they work. There's some sort of little rough things that are like beans. They're sorting something, maybe pecans. They're maybe building something. There's some boys as well as men, and they're sitting at tables in rows. So these are good. We're gonna move on from here. They're using some kind of small tool, good. So now I want you to say, what do you think this is? What's going on here? What is this a picture of? Boys without hats have dark hair, okay? So they're, the people who are in this picture have very dark hair, and the couple of faces that you can see, they have features that are Indian or could be Latino perhaps. Someone says, I think they're working in a factory or an assembly line. So my question then would be a follow-up question. What makes you say that? What makes you say that this is a factory or an assembly line? So possibly Latino men in a warehouse. So another thing I would say, what makes you say they're Latino? We talked about they have dark hair and their features. They're doing the same thing intently. That's a really nice way of wording that they're working in an assembly line or something like that. So, okay, now what I want you to do is to say, what questions do you have? And the tool we're going to use for that is a sentence stems. So I'm going to tell you, if you could ask these people a question, what would you like to ask? So start with this sentence, how do you, or where do you, and turn that into a question. So, and someone asked, what year is this taking place? So you're not obligated to follow my sentence stem, but when you're working with English learners, they're trying to learn the content, they're trying to learn the tools of analysis, and they're trying to learn the forms of asking the questions. So let's spot them the form of the question. So how do you enjoy your job? Great example. How do you use the cans in your workspace? Great example. So sentence stems are a key tool for working with English learners. And if you don't have a copy of this book, They Say, I Say, you got to get one. They're really cheap. I think they're under $10. And it is a master design tool to help you design a whole range of sentence stems to be as sophisticated as you want or to direct them towards a specific goal. Okay, so this is the tool that we've been using, the Observe, Reflect, Question tool from the Library of Congress. And we like to use stems to help support questioning and support the expression. But this form is not just about observing and analysis, it's also about investigation. So think about how you would find out more about this, this primary source. So Alison, can you talk a bit about strategies that you can use to further investigation?
Sure. Well, the way this slide is set up is to, in fact, connect back to the ideas of representation and engagement and action that Rich mentioned at the beginning. And if you were thinking about how to help students explore a primary source further, one thing is to expand the text set by adding additional primary sources that bring other ways into the same topic. What would be sources that would that might give more information about this photograph? For example, engaging people's empathy and imagination by having them imagine and think about what they know from this scene and predict what is going to happen next, what would happen at the end of the day, and answer that question. What makes you say that? Explain your reasoning. and using what they've observed to take some kind of action, whether it's to something as simple as what's a caption for this photograph, or something larger like how would you use this image and what you've learned from it to change your textbook. What kind of text would you put next to this if it were in a museum? So having students use what they have the ideas they've been developing is a great way to build on taking further action. Rich, why don't you talk a little bit about what we could do further with information about one particular image or source?
Yeah. So we're going to provide you with some additional source information. And what I want you to do is to think about what additional questions that raises. So someone had asked, when is this? The Library of Congress, which is where this comes from, tells us that it was part of the New Deal photo projects by the federal government, the Farm and Security Administration, taken in 1939. And it tells us that these are Mexican pecan shellers. So whoever guessed pecans was right on. Removing meats from the shell, Union Plant, San Antonio, Texas. So there's some really interesting detail. Now, I added an annotation to this, which I always do with primary sources in a source set, as a note to myself to tell me that this collection includes several photos from this date in Texas, including their homes and non-union shellers. So what questions, go back in the chat, what questions do you have now? So here's a sentence stem you could use. Again, a complex sentence structure that says, now that I learned blank about these people, I want to know why blank. So now that I learned that these are union members, I want to know why that makes a difference. So why are they in the union? Great question, Ken. Other questions that come up once you know a little bit more. What other questions have you guys got? Okay, another question might be, now that I learned that these people are from Mexico, I want to know why they are where they are and doing the work they did. Why did you choose this job? And then a question we always want students to ask is, great one, Kyle, why was this picture taken? Who took it? And then a great question, are they Mexicans or Mexican-American immigrants? And who put that in the Library of Congress to call them Mexicans? What does that mean? So great follow-up questions. And getting students to ask those questions is the heart of engagement and expression. So there's our image again. And again, I'm going to pass it to Alison to talk about, okay, we've got a primary source that we've gotten the students to really wrestle with, come up with some ideas. What are some more things we can do?
I just want to introduce this by saying Rich is referring a lot to supporting English learners because we use immigration often as a content when we're working with examples of how to make work more accessible specifically for English learners. But these are techniques that work with all students. Students who you're working with remotely, students who may have barriers of any kind, and students you don't know have barriers. So this is good teaching. So one is that before you begin to explore an unfamiliar resource or a source, start with a familiar picture or image or document and do the observe, reflect, question sequence before expecting active participation with a historical primary source. So that provides scaffolding for that kind of representation. Providing a hook where you connect with students' experience, in this case, experience of work, experience knowing people who immigrated or moved, possibly experience with unions in this particular example, are ways of getting students engaged with the content. Previewing the vocabulary you're going to use, and making sure that people know, what does immigration mean? What are you meaning when you're asking people to observe or notice or examine or reflect? And we've talked with teachers who've said that they never realized until they began to teach vocabulary how valuable it was for all of their students. They took for granted that many students knew words that are really helpful to go over. And using sentence stems, as we just have together, can get things going with a class, whether or not there are English learners in your class, and as a way of scaffolding, getting ideas out on the page and taking things to the next step.
Great, thanks, Alison. Okay, so now what I want to do is to really talk about immigration history. And again, remember, we're going to be modeling these tools. And as Alison just said, we're going to focus on English learners, but we know that really these methods support all learners. They make learning more fun. Primary sources make learning more fun, and these are ways to deepen that experience. When we think about immigration, there's some key frameworks that support understanding of immigration. One is that immigration is tied up with questions of identity, and in particular, questions of citizenship. So who belongs? Who's a citizen? Who belongs at all, citizen or not? And who decides who belongs? We're going to present an immigration framework. When people think about immigration, they often tell stories about their family or about their favorite movie. And so people think of immigration, they often think of stories, but the case we're going to make is that all immigration stories share some common elements in a framework. And when you know that framework, it allows you to compare stories, which is hugely valuable, to look for patterns. So then we're going to look at historical trends and say, well, what causes those patterns? What happens over time that causes immigration to wax and wane, for example? One of the key factors in understanding immigration is to understand how law and policy affects immigrants and communities, the larger community as well as the immigrant community, and affects the economy. And in particular, we're going to look at English learners and how they fit in all this. So why teach immigration history? We teach immigration history a lot in America, but why when you're thinking about English learners? Well, a lot of English learners are immigrants, and even those who aren't often identify with immigrants. So for example, people from Puerto Rico are not immigrants because they were born US citizens, but they often identify with immigrants. And so it's really valuable to understand immigration stories and frameworks to help those learners. Looking at immigration history expands our understanding of who is in America, what makes up America, what does it mean to be American, and expands those voices. There are some nasty stereotypes about immigrants out there, have been ever since the country began, and understanding more about immigration helps to counter those stereotypes. And investigating immigration is a great way to help students learn to do investigation and to make the whole enterprise of learning more exciting. So we use guiding questions in our work a lot, overarching themes, and the question we already introduced, who belongs in America and who decides who belongs? So we're going to come back to this question, but this is really what drives our investigation. Who belongs here and who gets to choose? So we're going to introduce the first of a couple of visual tools. I encourage another resource I'm going to point you to is a book called Thinking Maps by a guy named David Hirely. And what he does in this is to present 8 different sort of structures for thinking maps, for visual representations, that if we teach students these 8 ways of thinking about visuals, They can apply those, they can build their own, but then they can understand when they learn a new system or a new tool. And frankly, learning a graphic organizer, it's just another set of vocabulary for an English learner. So we need to explicitly teach this. So the one we're going to start with is the circle map, a number of things, but I like to use it at the beginning of a unit or a lesson to learn what students think they know. There's a difference between what we know and what we think we know, because sometimes what we know is wrong. And this is a tool that can help us sort that out a bit. So the way you do this, if you're face-to-face, you draw a circle. If you're doing it online, you do it in a virtual format like I'm going to do. And you write the topic in the center. So we're going to put immigrant in the center, immigrants. And then in the next circle out, you add ideas, examples. What do we think we know about that topic? And then outside the circle, we're going to identify, how do we know those things? Where did we learn that? So again, go to the chat. I'll point out that Alison Noyes posted a link to a description of how to use this circle map tool that's in our on our website. There's a number of these teaching strategies we explain there and give examples and links to organizations that we've worked with. So what do we think we know about immigrants? So post your ideas in the chat. What do you know about immigrants? So for example, you might say, some immigrants come to America and send money home. That's a thing that I think I know about immigrants. So anything else? What do you know about immigrants? Could be anything. They are refugees. They move for a variety of reasons. Now, at this point, if I was writing these up on the board or writing them in a form, I would copy them exactly as you're saying and then discuss whether these things are, to what extent are these correct or not, and how do we know? So some immigrants may not speak English. Immigrants speak a different language. They often move to have a better opportunity, getting at the push and pull factors and why they move. They could have connections to the new country already. Okay, this is great, great stuff. They may have left family behind. So I summarized several of the things that have come up when I've done this activity. So an immigrant is somebody who was born abroad. They're hard workers. So there's a stereotype. It's positive, but it's still a stereotype. We want to identify that that is a stereotype. Sometimes they left for religious persecution reasons. And sometimes they are stereotyped and they're told they're not welcome. And again, more ideas. And then around the outside of this, you would say, well, where do we learn these things? So where do we learn these things? From TV, from Facebook, maybe from our 5th grade social studies unit on immigration. Maybe we learn it from politicians. You would start by sort of identifying, we've already identified that you guys in fact know a fair amount about immigration. I want to question your assumptions about some things as we go, and you may already be questioning these, but I want to make sure we underscore that. So here's a question. Are these groups that I'm going to list here, are these immigrants, Native Americans? Are they immigrants? Are they ever immigrants? They certainly can be migrants, but are they ever immigrants? Enslaved people. Well, if we talk about people moving here, well, they didn't choose to move here. So are they still immigrants or are they something different? Certainly when you talk to African-American people about immigration, they often have very different perspective on immigration. And the notion of saying we're a nation of immigrants means different things to different people. US citizens by conquest, so people from Puerto Rico, we already identified, people from California, people from Colorado. There were people who were here already when the United States invaded Mexico and annexed that territory to the United States. Citizens of colonial possessions, so places that the United States took control of, like Hawaii, became citizens. My kids are adopted from Korea. They identify as immigrants, but they are international adoptees. They didn't make a choice to come here. They came because I went and got them. Okay, so we want to look at immigration stories. We talked about immigration stories. And I'm going to start with one of my favorite primary source sets at the Library of Congress, the collection of letters of Carl Schurz. The letters stretch from 1841 to 1869. We'll come to his life dates in a bit. So this is one of the letters, or two of the letters. We're going to look at chunks of these. We're not going to read the whole letter, and that's an important factor when you're thinking about English learners and other struggling learners, is that you got to pick your documents carefully, and you got to pick the elements of those documents carefully. So we're also going to support the documents with a photograph of the gentleman. And he lived from 1829 to 1906. He lived a long time and he did a lot in his life. This is a Matthew Brady photo. You probably know him from his photographs from the Civil War. And so here's a couple of the excerpts from this letter that's to his parents that we're going to look more closely at. So we're looking at a story here. And Alison, can I have you read? This is a letter that Mr. Schurz wrote in July of 23 of 1849. So can you read these excerpts?
Sure, and I'm going to note that I just switched out of the chat and into the full screen, so I'd be able to read this. And I'll just remind any of you who find the visual pretty small that if you switch your view to full screen, lots will be a lot more legible. So, on the day of capitulation, the next hour will bring the Prussians through our gates, and we shall be in the hands of our most embittered enemies. I see my life ending where it ought really to begin, my liberty destroyed. For the last time, our drums are beating in the streets. I put on belt and sword in order to surrender to the enemy. 'Tis time to bid you farewell.
Pretty dramatic story, huh? Okay, he's writing a letter to his friends and he's talking about what's going to happen to him. The Prussian soldiers are coming through the gates and he's expecting to be arrested and maybe even killed. Okay, so that's July 23. July 31, just a week later, and this is a letter to his parents. So can you read this, Alison? What's the story?
At last I find a moment of quiet to let you know that I am rescued and free, both through a hazardous enterprise which ended as successfully as it was begun boldly. I am here in a Swiss village near Basel. My money resources, because I was able to save little from Rastatt, are so small that I shall not be able to live on them for 3 days. Ask of Frau Erbluch, sorry, I don't speak German, or elsewhere, if someone may be disposed to support me up to the moment that I can sell my diary.
Well done, thank you. And again, dramatic story. So, okay, he didn't die, he didn't get arrested, he got out and he made it to Switzerland. But he's out of money, and what's his plan? He wants to borrow money from Frau Erbschloh, whoever she is, and then what's he gonna do? He's gonna sell his diary. So he's a writer. Okay, so this is a great story, but we're talking about English learners. What vocabulary is gonna be like, oh my gosh, this is tough. I find a moment of quiet. That's not too bad. Okay, hazardous enterprise. Oh my gosh, that's difficult. All right, so rather than go through this item by item, which your students could do or you could do, we're going to use a tool that identified these words as the ones that would be most likely to be difficult. And the tool is called Rewordify. It's a free tool online, and what you do is you copy the text, you paste it into that little block, and you say, I want you to translate this. So the word hazardous enterprise got translated as dangerous business or dangerous project. Okay, that works. Those are more likely to be things that a student will know. There's a number of other things that Rewordify can do. We're going to look at another one of the tools that it has. One of the things it can help you do is to determine the lexile or the reading level of a text, and it gives you a couple of different tools for doing that. Okay, so on the right is a secondary source from the Library of Congress describing this collection of letters, and on the left is my summary of that. So Carl Schurz at the ripe age of what was he, 19, ran away from the revolutions of 1848, and he ended up as a journalist in Wisconsin. And he was one of the early Republican Party activists there. And then during the Civil War, he joined the Union Army and in fact recruited a whole bunch of German-speaking soldiers to fight for the Union Army. Was quite a successful officer. He was a good officer. After the war, he played a number of roles for the federal government. He was a US ambassador to Spain. He was a US senator from Missouri by that point. And later he was the Secretary of the Interior and was an early conservationist. And then he went back to being a journalist, including writing a really excellent biography of Abraham Lincoln and another of Henry Clay. So here's a secondary source to enrich our story. We've looked at some letters, we've looked at photographs, we looked at a secondary source that tells his story, and now we're looking at a broader analysis of the Civil War. And there's a book called The Civil War Was Won by Immigrant Soldiers. And this man, Don Doyle, makes the case that it was foreigners joining the war to wage the battles that they were fighting in that revolution back in Germany. He wanted to continue those equalitarian ideals here. And so he signed up and brought a whole bunch of his country people into the war with him. And here's a really lovely drawing, Alfred Woe, the Civil War artist, of a Union soldier wearing a German-style pickle hat. So we've got a pretty good story here about this guy. So let's take that story and break it down a bit. And the tool we're going to use, another David Hirely thinking map, is a flow map. A flow map is for examining cause and effect. And so the event that we're going to give you an example of, just to explain the form, is not returning your library book. So maybe the reason you didn't is because you lost it or your dog ate it. And the effects of it are going to be that you have to buy a replacement and they're not going to let you check out any more books. I would point out that a flow map can be chronological, as this is, but it can also be cyclical. It could involve choices that someone makes. And I would point out that you having to buy a replacement book is in itself an event that will have the effect of you'll have less money. So causes and effects lead from one to another. What the flow map does is it helps English learners and any learners to understand that flow. And again, it could be geographic. It could move in from one place to another. His story moves from Germany to Switzerland, to Wisconsin, to Missouri, to Washington, DC. Okay, so every immigration story has 5 phases to it, or 5 steps. There's a decision to leave home. So in his case, his decision to leave home happened why? At the point of a bayonet, he ran out of his home country. Making plans for a journey, actually making the journey, arriving in the new country, and then adjusting to your new home. Do these make sense that these fit for every immigration story? You could look at these 5 elements. Now, in the case of Carl Schurz, when we look at these, we know why he left. That's really dramatic, great part of his story. His making plans for the journey were kind of on the fly. He was going to sell his diary. We don't really know what happened with that. In this case, we don't really know anything about his journey itself other than he was in Switzerland a while. And we don't really know about his experience when we first got to America. But the last piece is a really dramatic piece of his story, which is adjusting to his new home. Did Carl Schurz adjust to being an American citizen? Boy, oh boy, did he. How successful could you possibly be? One of the reasons I like this story is because it's not the conventional turn of the 20th century story of the golden age of immigration. It's a very important immigration story from 60 years earlier, and it helps us to understand that the immigration story actually continues throughout American history. When I show you one of these yellow slides, I'm teasing you by showing you a process that we're not actually going to do, but I'm giving you some instruction that you could use with your students or with peers. So how you would use the flow map, one of the things we do is after students understand it, we have them go through a primary source packet and pick one and decide which step on the flow chart it fits, and then be ready to explain why they think that that letter is a really good example of his decision to leave, for example. All right, so we're going to look at some more teaching strategies. The first of those is to think about expanding the voices that we're studying. Now, many of you may know this photograph from a little bit later, from the golden age of immigration, from I believe it's 1907. And the photograph is of Ellis Island. It says right at the bottom, inspectors examining eyes of immigrants, Ellis Island. And I would point out to you that 1882 was the first legislation that it started to exclude people from immigrating to America. Carl Schurz just came. There was no law that said he could or couldn't. He just came, and that was okay with everybody. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese people. We're not going to go into detail about that, but just to point out that race-based exclusion was at the heart of the beginning of immigration law in America. Another thing that happened at the beginning of immigration law, that same year, an act passed that included language that said that any convict, lunatic, idiot, or person unable to take care of him or herself shall not be permitted to land at Ellis Island. Okay, time out. We just saw some really offensive language. And one of the things that when you're working with primary sources, you gotta do is to think about what language is gonna come up and prepare your students to have clear ground rules for how you're gonna deal with it. Yes, you may quote those terms if you're quoting a piece of legislation. No, you may not use them in class, and it's never okay to joke about such terms. So it's important to build a community of safety in your class. I'm going to try this, and we're going to see if the audio works. Somebody signal me if it's not working for everybody. This is one of the things I want to do is to bring a little bit of different voices. So there's a couple of really great clips of immigration history that advance our story a bit. And there's no sound at first. So
Ozawa's from Japan. He comes to the United States. He makes the claim that he's white and therefore he should be a citizen based on his skin color. And he says to the court, you know, if you look under, you know, my arm, under my shirt, like my skin is lighter than so many of these other European people's. You know, I am white. Furthermore, I have learned English. I have taught my children English. I go to a church. I think he attended Berkeley. You know, he's just saying, I am a patriot, make me an American. And he's pointing out his skin color as a way of becoming white. So the Supreme Court comes back to this and says, only Caucasians are white. And you, Ozawa, are not a Caucasian. Therefore, you are not white. And they deny him citizenship based on that.
Okay, and then we're going to listen to a second story. And I linked out to do that, so I know I'll need to go back to my slides.
The next case that comes 3 months later is US versus Thind. And he is from India. He even serves for the US military. He says, he takes a look at the Ozawa case and he says, well, I've learned something. I'm claiming my Caucasianness. And at the time, the racial sciences at the time were saying, oh, you know, this is the Caucasian race. And it goes all the way down, you know, to India, right? So in that sense, he's correct by the terms of science at that time. So he says, I'm Caucasian, therefore I'm white. The Supreme Court turns around and says, I think that the everyday, you know, white American would be very surprised to think that somebody like Thind is considered white. you may be Caucasian, but you are not white. And so they start to define whiteness by what the everyday white person thinks whiteness is. And this is the early 1920s. I think this says a lot for the power of everyday people looking around, looking at phenotype and making decisions based on that. And the Supreme Court in some regard kind of cleans its hands and says, you know, it's up to the majority population to decide.
Okay, we're going to go back to, do you guys see my slides again? Okay, thumbs up, great. All right, so again, part of the reason why I wanted to do that was to bring in a little bit different voice, but I also, it brings our story forward and says that what began with the Chinese Exclusion Act has gotten more sophisticated as the immigrants themselves have pushed the dominant society pushed back. So now we're going to look at a part of that pushback. So this is a, here's some of the stereotypes that, again, you want to set ground rules before you look at something like this. And I'm going to zoom in to a couple of parts of it. You might do the observe, reflect, question tool with this just to get students beginning familiar with it. But what I want you to do is to look at a couple of segments of this image. And what I want you to think about is not just, well, they're nasty stereotypes, but what are the objections? What is it that the people who are objecting to Chinese immigration fear? What do they fear? So post in the chat, what do you see here? And I'll read the text. You probably can't read this. It says, as an industrious anarchist, for example, they're saying that Chinese people are going to blend into society and hide as an industrious anarchist. So what's that about? What are they afraid of there? The other one is, or disguised as a humble Irishman. Okay, why is it bad for them to hide disguise themselves as an Irishman? What's wrong with Irishmen? What is it that they're afraid of? Maybe afraid of them taking jobs. Absolutely. He's got his hat out. He wants money. Anything different? They're definitely different from the mainstream 1900 image of middle-class white America that would have been the consumers of this political cartoon. What about the guy on the left? What are they afraid of? What's he going to do? What is it that violence? They're afraid of anarchist violence. So Antifa is building on a long history of fear of anarchist violence, taking your money. Okay, great. So using a primary source as a way for students to analyze the thinking. And again, what that does is it helps us, if you use the whole political cartoon, you could come up with quite a list of the things that the anti-immigration people were concerned about. Whether they were legitimate concerns or not, they were concerned about the economy, about people losing jobs and so forth. Okay, so we want to look at linguistic supports for students to learn some of these complex concepts. And I'm going to point you to a book. It's on the Common Core, but that's just about teaching literacy. And this is from TESOL, the Teaching English as a Second Language people. And one of the things that they did was to say that, one of the things that's tough about history and social science is these big concepts that we have, things like freedom and stuff like that. So how do you help English learners and other struggling learners to extract concepts from sources? So we're going to look at another primary source. In this case, it's an interview with
We would all be in the same bus, the other children, and they would drop us off in front of the white school, this beautiful manicured lawn school with palm trees and a wonderful playground right there in the front with swings. And then we had to walk to the Mexican school. The school books were all handed down, so they'd be torn. And we were being taught how to be good maids. We were being taught how to clean, how to sew, how to quilt, We weren't being taught academics. As a 9-year-old girl, all I was thinking is, when we went to court, that they were fighting for me to go to this beautiful school, never realizing exactly what they were fighting for. What was going on in Westminster was not right. 1896. LA Times. We had a judge in Los Angeles called Judge McCormick, who said that separate is never equal. And it had like a ripple effect all over Southern California. The theaters were eventually integrated and housing became easier to move to different areas. And I'll never forget the first day I walked into that school, and this little boy comes up to me and he says, "You're a Mexican. What are you Mexicans doing here? Don't you know that Mexicans don't belong in the school? You're not supposed to be in the school." When that boy said that to me, I felt this pain in my heart, like somebody had stabbed me. I felt so hurt, so humiliated that I started crying. And I go home and I tell my mother, "Mother, I don't want to be in that school. They don't want us there. They don't want Mexicans there." And my mother said to me, "Sylvia, weren't you aware of what we were fighting for all this time? You were there in court every day. Don't you know exactly what we wanted for you? We wanted for you to know that you are just as equal as that boy. That's what we were fighting for you, for you not to feel humiliated, for you not to feel inferior, because under God, you're just as good as he is."
So again, a great story. One of the things you could do with this is to talk about, in her case, she's actually not an immigrant, but she's experiencing some discrimination as if she were. So this is a transcript, a segment of the trial transcript that she was describing. And I point this out to again underscore that intersection between immigration, race, and ability. And so this is, Mr. Marcus is the lawyer for the Mendez family. And he said, Mr. Kent's the superintendent of schools. "In your opinion, is a child retarded because of the fact that he speaks or is a bilingual, in other words, speaks Spanish and English?" And the superintendent says, "That is one of the factors. Yes, sir." So the lawyer clarifies or reinforces, "Now, isn't it a fact, Mr. Kent, that a child has a more comprehensive knowledge, at least linguistically speaking, because of the fact that he's able to speak both Spanish and English?" And the superintendent of schools said, "I would say not." So again, my point here is to underscore that race, immigration, and ability are tied together. So this case was decided in 1947. And this is again, a secondary source, a story that you might use to understand what happened. And what we're going to do with this is to, again, I'm going to walk you through what we would do, is to look at a secondary text, circle the verbs, circle the actions, and then think about cause and effect. So again, remember that when the people from TESOL looked at teaching social studies, one of the things they said that was most difficult was to understand these big concepts like cause and effect. So they came up with this tool to do that. So here's that secondary source with the verbs circled. So the Mendez family tried to enroll their children. The Mendez children were assigned to this school that was established as a Mexican school. The families joined with the Mendez family to sue the school district. So what you do with those is, once the English learners understand the verbs, what's happening, what's going on, what's the action, then they can think about cause and effect. So if an event is that the Mendez children were assigned to the Hoover School, then an effect was that those families sued the school district. One of the effects of that was that the superintendent of schools used stereotypes to explain school policy. And the attorney for the family called in social scientists to address those stereotypes and point out how ridiculous they were. One of them being that the Mendezes were actually from Puerto Rico, not from Mexico originally. So remember I told you that rewordify.com tool, one of the other things it does, remember I said it does other things, you can use it to pull out the parts of speech. So the students could paste the text in and then it will show them which are the verbs, which are the nouns, adjectives, and so forth. So the key takeaway from this story is that 7 years before Brown v. Board of Education, in an immigration case, the 14th Amendment was invoked by a federal judge to say that you could not discriminate, that separate was not equal, that you couldn't discriminate based on, in this case, race and perceived nationality. Now, Thurgood Marshall, later the NAACP lawyer who led the case that won Brown v. Board of Education, actually wrote a friend of the court brief on the Mendez case. So one of the stories that one of the points I'm trying to make here is that stories of civil rights by African Americans and Mexicans perceived as immigrants are also intertwined, and that in order to understand any of these stories, they knew each other. They were working together all through the 1950s. Okay, so we've talked a bunch about primary sources, and we've given you some ideas of of how to work with them. And I've used the term text set. What do I mean by a text set? Well, a text set is where you've got more than one primary source that help build a more robust story. So here's an immigration text set. All of these are from the Library of Congress. 2 of the photos are in the textbook that the students have. There's a map from around 1900 showing where people were coming to America from. There's the photo that we looked at. There's also a political cartoon. So those together tell a richer story than just one. Here's another text set from a literature course. The book is Heart of Darkness. This is a high school African literature course. So Heart of Darkness, written from the perspective of a white colonialist. Things Fall Apart is a novel written, or a book written by an African writer. King Leopold's Ghost is a secondary source telling about Belgian colonial experience. And then there's a great political cartoon in which Africa is being divided up by all these little guys with French and Turkish and German and British flags. And then behind them is a map that is literally the map that was used to carve up Africa. So instead of just reading the book, you're looking at all of this robust set of alternate sources to make the story richer. So I'm going to encourage you to expand your text set even further. So this is one of my favorite things from the Library of Congress. This is a poster from the 1970s, the United Farm Workers lettuce and grape strike or boycott to support Mexican field workers in mostly in the American West. And partly what this story does is it begins to help you to align the study of history with concerns of your students today. You may have students who are agricultural workers, or their families are. And story, maybe if they're not, maybe it's their immediate background, or they may have family members who are. And so it's a story that helps both to empower all learners, because it talks about a story of empowerment, and it also brings our narrative up and has 2 great American leaders, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, at the center of those stories. Let's look at another primary source, a more current one. So what do you see when you look at this image? What do you observe? There's some great comments in the chat, by the way, that I encourage people to go look at. A book about the struggle for justice by Mexican Americans that Jolene put there. Okay, so what's going on? Joy, gratitude. Just what do you observe in these people? There's 2 women and a man. What do you notice about their clothing, about the obvious joy on their faces? What's the woman on the left wearing? It's a hijab, exactly. Okay, so I'm going to tell you more about this image. On the left is Representative Ilhan Omar, and she's arriving at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport in 2019. And on the right is Representative Pramila Jayapal. So the story of immigration becomes interesting, becomes deeper when you look at what's going on in the 2018 election when Congress became more diverse than it had ever been before. So it's a different kind of immigration story. Now, these 2 people have taken a lot of flack and stood up for a lot of things, so they're pretty interesting stories in themselves. So expanding a text set allows you to do a lot of things. It allows you to broaden the representation that you're giving to students. And that doesn't just mean giving visuals to students with limited reading ability. It means giving them a rich contextualization and corroboration of those sources. It gives students choices about what they're going to look at. And it helps to either whether you assign different primary sources or whether they choose them to differentiate reading levels and complexity of concepts. Working together to process several primary sources, they learn to work together to generate their own questions and to develop the process of learning. And they learn to do research within that realm of the sources you're giving them. And in our case, we're also helping them to challenge the status quo, which is a core piece of culturally relevant pedagogy that I pointed to from our friends in Minnesota. So where are you going to find primary sources on immigration? So most of you are probably familiar, but I don't like to assume. The Library of Congress, a great shortcut is to go straight to the teachers page. And when you get there, there are text sets there, primary source sets, lesson plans, which I often use just to mine them to get the primary sources that are used in those lessons. And there are some presentations, the ones on immigration at the Library of Congress are fabulous. There's a timeline there that I really encourage you to use. And so if you do a search on the teacher's page under classroom materials, you get, this is just the top of the search. There's a whole bunch of items, 33 items, sets of classroom materials on immigration, just on the teacher's page. This is an example of the text set that they have on immigration. You may recognize that map that we saw in one of the earlier text sets. I would also send you to our website again, Emerging America. We have a page called Immigrant History Through Primary Sources that points to a number of the very best collections at the Library of Congress and other places. We also have a number of teacher-written accessible lessons that use the Universal Design for Learning model, they are on immigration history. We also have a robust collection on disability history, by the way. And so when you go into those, you can also find the primary sources, but also find strategies for using those in an accessible means. Okay, let's look at some more teaching strategies. Again, Common Core, nobody uses that terminology anymore, but everybody still uses the core ideas, which are one of the core parts of the Common Core is that writing arguments to support claims using sources and good reasoning is at the core of writing literacy. So we're going to look at making claims. Remember, that was the thing that the TESOL people said is one of the toughest things to do. So this is a lesson plan that's on our website on immigration versus nativism. It's an 11th grade lesson. And her guiding question for this lesson is, how did the attitudes and perspectives of nativists determine which immigrants were accepted by Americans as the right kind or rejected as the wrong kind? And so in this case, what you would do is to identify the factors that were grounds for the nativists' objections and make a claim. Why are you saying that this was one of their objections? Now, we looked at a primary source and we figured out that, okay, having your hat out and expecting money was one of their concerns. So that could be one of your claims. And you have the students pick from a packet of primary sources and use one of those sources to make their claim and support it. So again, here's an image that we've already seen. You could use this to argue that they were concerned about the economy, they were concerned about violence, and the students could make that case. Okay, so having students search for primary sources is always a great thing when you can do it. And if you are not familiar with Chronicling America, you gotta get there. This is from the Pueblo, Colorado chieftain from 1921. Remember, this is that period when the Ozawa and the Thind cases were decided against Asian immigrants. And here's a story about Chinatown. So you could send students into the Chronicling America to find stories about immigration or about any other topic. It's a great, great place, ponds to have them fish in. They're guaranteed to catch a trout every time. Okay, so we've brought our history up to, in some ways, the current, to the present, and we've seen some patterns. When you look at this diagram, it shows the ebbs and flows of immigration. You see back in just before the Civil War, that's when Mr. Schurz came. There was, of course, a massive wave of immigration around the 1900. And then there's a trough. Okay, my graphic didn't work on this one. There's supposed to be a circle right around that trough that's at between late 1930s and 1940. So why is there a trough? Why do we see peaks and valleys? And again, what you would want to do is have students use primary sources to make that case. So in this case, we're taking data in the form of a visual representation and saying, look at this, analyze it, and make a case using primary sources. So you could use that same political cartoon to say, well, there was an anti-immigrant wave that got this legislation passed, and Supreme Court decisions in 1924, there was immigration legislation that closed off immigration. And then there was the Great Depression. People didn't come to America because the economy here was on the rocks. And then during the war, people just couldn't safely move. So then what happened afterwards? The big story is that in 1965, major legislation passed that opened the door up again. And then that really high peak was when a number of people who were here undocumented were recognized all at once and given a path to citizenship in the 1990s. But you'll see that the wave of immigration has continued to grow and grow. This ends in 2012, and there was some decline after the recession of 2008. So why waves and troughs? There's an article that is in the conference articles that I recommended. The Kirk article, there's a great detailed timeline in there. I also said there's one at the Library of Congress that would allow you or allow students to analyze. Oh, there it is. So here's that trough. Why is there a trough? And here's a primary source that could help you to analyze that. So now I want to use a different kind of source material. And I want you guys to just know about this. It's a great, great resource. I looked for Colorado 2017. What are the most common foreign birthplaces of residents? Those of you from Colorado and neighboring states will not be surprised to find out that the largest group by far is from Mexico. They lump everybody from Africa together, which is kind of odd. But then Germany is the next largest group. You might or might not have known that. India, China. So what this does, this is an interactive tool. You can look at any state and you can look at a number, you can look by decade and figure out where people came from. It also shows what states people came from. And so what we're going to do is to compare that to 1960. I was born in Denver in 1959, so I would have been one of the born local folks. But in 1960, when you look at where people came from, Germany was actually the largest group. And Mexico didn't come in until fourth, and only 4,600 people from Mexico. So Europe was the source of most of the people in most of the non-native born immigrants to Colorado in 1960. So that's a pretty interesting story in itself. You could have students look across the decades and explain why those changes. One of the other things we want to do to help students identify with this understanding history is to look at stories that matter to them. So if they're immigrants, the best place for understanding immigration history or immigration policy that I know of is a place called the Immigrant Learning Center. It happens to be in Massachusetts, but they do great work on national immigration policy. Another great organization, and they offer a whole approach to teaching immigration history and migration history, is called Reimagining Migration. And for example, they have a unit on teaching about the deferred action, what's CA stand for? These are the dreamers. And using that as a way to understand public policy and the debates around policy and elections and so forth. Today's English learners, who are they? Now let's go back to our question from the beginning. Who belongs in America and who decides who belongs here? So let's look at some of the strengths and the needs of English learners. First of all, looking nationally, who are the English learners? Spanish by far, almost 8 million of the EL students in America are Spanish speakers. 136,000 Arabic, 106,000 Chinese. This is from 2017. The percentage of EL students in each group, almost 75% Spanish speaking, and so forth. So it's important to know who your students are in any given school district. I know school districts where there's 70 languages spoken in the district. Again, another source for data shows what proportion of students in any given state are English learners. So in Colorado, it's about 12%, Utah, 7%, Montana, only 2.2%, and of course, California, 19%. In California, almost every teacher has a number of English learners in their classroom. So why do English learners struggle in school? And we're going to listen to just a little bit of this student's story, talking about a current story for these students.
My name is Abubakar. I come from Africa, Guinea. Some people in my family, they don't care about the school. So my teacher just go to class. He don't like to teach us.
My life back home was really not leading to a success. When it comes to school, I go to school, but I don't go to school all the time, and they don't care.
when I first came, I did not speak no English, and I was not feeling good because I see old people speaking English, and I was like, what are they talking about?
Our school is in the South Bronx. The immigrant population within the area does not arrive as highly educated as other immigrant populations around the city. So automatically I knew that one of the driving questions for our school would be, how do you manage, how do you develop a school that supports students who are entering with low literacy in their native language?
Kids had inconsistent education for many reasons. Their schools might have been burned down, so they might have missed a chunk of school. They might have never gone to school a day in their lives, or maybe they've gone to school every day and the quality of their education might have been compromised. Who are these kids as language learners, and what's their English language proficiency?
My native language, I didn't know how to write it or how to read in French. You give me a French, I'll think this is another language, not even a French, because I didn't know how to read it.
When I came here, the teacher gave us work to do, but I couldn't understand nothing. What she tell me and what she tell us to do, I couldn't understand.
Okay, it's a longer video, but we're going to move on, because what I wanted you to do was to think about current day immigrants. Many of them are younger, and many of them didn't have good education in the country they came from. So one of the difficulties that they may have is to understand the relevance of what they're learning in the content, that they don't understand what it has to do with what they already know. They may not know a lot of the things that somebody who grew up in the United States, particularly somebody who's had a little bit of money and been able to travel or whatever, would know. So they need background. And they may have strong gaps in academic vocabulary, which is not only just the words, but the structures, as Mary pointed out earlier. Some sentence structures are very difficult for English learners. So what do you do about this? One of the things is to know your students, to help them make connections to the things that they bring to the classroom. They may have, for example, agricultural experience that you can relate to, or economic experience, and giving them plenty of opportunities to interact with each other. You need to build their background. They don't bring it, so you've got to tell them things that will help them put things in context. Again, some great resources in the chat. The Newcomer's book is a fascinating and eye-opening way to understand some of this. Thinking about felt experiences versus verbal definitions, go to those things that are going to engage them, the things they care about. And you need to explicitly teach vocabulary, not every single word. If they're studying the Civil War, they really don't need to know what a mini ball is. If they, forget it, that's obscure vocabulary. Do they need to know what abolitionism was? You bet. They can't understand the Civil War if they don't understand a concept like that. Using graphic organizers, but as we've suggested, be selective and be strategic about what you're using, because every time they learn one, it's a new set of vocabulary they need to learn. And structuring a lot of time to talk with each other and with you. Now, I have to point out that a lot of the strategies we're talking about are focused on level 3 and 4 English learners, not necessarily people who just got here last week. They need particularly focused help. But I will point out too that level 5 and 6 English learners are the ones who you heard interviewed in that video. They get along okay, but in fact, they're still missing a lot of academic background. And they will spend their whole lives being English learners because they weren't born with it. One of the other things I want to point out is that some students, like I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, it's a college town. There's a lot of English learners here who come where both of their parents are doing postdoctoral work. Those kids are going to be fine in school because they get the academic language at home. But kids who come to a classroom and they don't speak English and their parents don't have that academic background, you need to provide them with additional supports. Okay, so we've got some time for questions or resources that people want to suggest. I'm going to stop sharing here and just take questions. Either put them in the chat or we're seeing using Goose Chase as part of the conference has allowed, Laura Israelson points out that having you learners use photographs of yourself, selfies, as a way to reference what you're doing. Great tool, particularly in the online learning environment. And she says, thanks.
And I'm going to encourage people, if they are up for unmuting and speaking aloud, we have an opportunity to do that here, and hearing voices can be a nice way to connect the suggestions and the questions that you may have. We also welcome if you are feeling more comfortable to work in the chat, but both are welcome.
Alison, why don't you tell them about the captioning tool, since you're the one that discovered it, the captioning tool that I'm using.
We've had a workaround because we work with accessibility so much, we really wanted to have captioning, and we have our slides in Google Slides, and I don't know if you can share your screen again, Rich, and navigate to the bottom, but on the bottom of the Google Slides controls is something called closed captioning, and you can simply turn it on, and if you're presenting over Google Slides, it will do real-time machine captioning for you. And as you notice, when Rich stopped sharing his screen, the captioning disappeared. But now that once Rich starts the slideshow again.
Yeah, that's not happening.
if Rich were to start the slideshow again, or I were, anyway, I'll demonstrate it in the background if I can share my screen with, we can take another question. But short answer is, if you present over any tool, Zoom or anything else that lets you use a slide deck, you can turn on the captions.
You can also, you have some choices. I like to have them at the top of the screen because they don't get in the way of the control panel that's at the bottom. One thing I want to make sure we do is to invite you all, if you would like to join us for, we have an asynchronous course that we're running from March 3rd to 30th. And Kyle, can you put the link in the chat? Oh, great, there it is. You can sign up. We're still taking folks. And it's fully asynchronous, but what we do is we have a cohort of people who go through at the same time. So there's a lot of discussion with other people. So basically, anytime during a week, you can get the work done. And then we have assignments that are due each week so that everybody's working together and you get to interact and learn from the other people in it. So it goes, as I say, from March 3rd to 30th. It's free. On teaching English learners, and we go into more depth with some of these strategies, and you will develop a learning activity using primary sources and walk away with that at the end of the program. It's a total of 6 hours that you get credit for. You get a letter saying they did this much work for 6 hours.
Right. While we wait for another question, I am going to try sharing my screen, and I'm going to show this. So I'll see whether that will work. All right, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, let me make it big. And I'm going to present. And if you see down here, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the shared screen.
We do.
But I'm going to click captions. And having done that, we've got captions running again. And it will capture not only my voice, but anyone else's voice. So Rich, will you say something?
Hi. What will it say? Now this is artificial intelligence captioning, so it's not perfect. It's probably about 90% accurate or 95%, which if you're an English learner or have hearing issues, that is a lot of help.
So I'm going to exit and see if I can turn the sharing back to
Other questions or comments, and we should hand things back over to Peggy. I know she's got some final comments in the last minute here. And thank you all. It's been a delight. It's been a gas to work with these guys.
Well, and I want to thank Rich and Alison. What a great presentation. And thank you so much. We so appreciate it. A few things just to wrap up. Please be sure to rate this session. Fill the button out. There's 3 short questions. And there's a contact hour certificate. And Kyle, when I finish, I'll ask you to tell them a little bit about it. We also have a book backpack prize, which Kyle did randomly, and that winner is Jenny Kitchen. Jenny, you are the winner of the prize for this session. Be sure to go to Goose Chase, lots of other prizes there. And the last thing I'll say is be sure to join us tomorrow for our keynote speaker is Sam Weinberg, and that will be a great presentation. So Kyle, did you want to talk a little bit about the contact hour certificates?
Yeah, just real quick, it'll be just on the linked on the end of the conference survey. So you'll get that on Friday and it'll be sent out through email.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again, Rich and Alison. You did a great job. And thank you all. There's lots of thanks in the chat. And that ends today. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks so much.
thank you.